Well, I'm Scott Sagan, professor of political science and co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation. It's a pleasure to invite Alex Debs back, even though it's virtual, back to the CSAC. Alex was a former Stanton Fellow at CSAC. He's now a professor of political science at Yale, has written widely, as most attendees know, on the logic of decisions to go to war, on nuclear proliferation decisions and counter-proliferation in a magisterial book with Nuno Monteiro. It's a pleasure to have you back, Alex. The ground rules are that you'll present. I'll look at the Q&A, and if I'm able to call on people, I'll call on them. If I'm not, I'm going to read their questions for you, and I'm sure I'll have a few myself. We have a tradition of trying to let the fellows ask the first few questions, however, okay?
Great, thank you. It's great to be back, if only virtually. I had such a great time when I visited 10 years ago. Time really flies. To the fellows, you're in for a treat. I think you've experienced it in the first few weeks of the academic year, but it's really, CSAC is really a special place. I'd like to thank Harold for the invitation, Emily for all her help with logistics, Scott for the introduction. The title is actually inspired in many ways by some of Scott's previous work on the causes of proliferation, and my own work in nuclear politics has mainly been on the causes of proliferation, and I didn't need to think very hard, or I felt like I could assume minimal things about the consequences of proliferation, and the minimum we could think about is the fact that nuclear weapons are weapons of the weak. They're the ultimate tools of deterrence, and weak states really want to acquire them. And then once we put them in their strategic framework and they interact with enemies who may try to prevent them from acquiring weapons, or allies who want to reassure them that they don't need them or coerce them from trying to acquire nuclear weapons, we can reflect on the odds of proliferation. Here, I'm reflecting on the consequences on proliferation. And if we go back before Scott's paper in the mid-90s, most of the literature in nuclear politics was reflecting on the consequences of proliferation. And the two questions I'm asking here are, how could states use nuclear weapons? And do greater nuclear capabilities improve coercive leverage? So those are two very important in understanding how states use nuclear weapons, nuclear posture, nuclear strategy, the size of arsenal. The dominant approach in answering this question is the theory of the nuclear revolution, which we can take back to Schelling, Jervis, Glaser, others, which says that nuclear weapons really bring peace because they deter from war. They're the ultimate tools of deterrence. So if we think back to Schelling, once a state has nuclear weapons, even though it may not prevail in the conflict, if it can threaten to use nuclear weapons, it could deter powerful states from attacking them. So what the theory of the nuclear revolution is a prediction on outcome, war or peace, in this case peace, because states have nuclear weapons, and also an argument about the mechanism that produces that outcome, that nuclear weapons are tools of deterrence. So if we think about this and its implications for the two questions I'm thinking of, how could they use nuclear weapons? Really to deter. If you have two nuclear weapon states, one is trying to compel or coerce the other to make changes to the status quo, and the other is trying to deter the first state and enforce the status quo, the deterrent state should have the advantage. It's hard to coerce, it's hard to compel, it may not be credible to threaten this unacceptable destruction when you've lived with the status quo, or when what you're trying to take away from the deterrent state are vital interests that it has controlled for some time. And do greater nuclear capabilities improve coercive leverage? TNR would say no. In the first place, it's hard to coerce and compel, but also what really matters is the balance of resolve rather than the balance of capabilities. Now that theory has come under fire. Some challenges which are mainly empirical. The first one is that actually the US has pursued nuclear superiority. This is something that TNR was very well aware of, and I think some of the initial impetus for the reaction to US nuclear strategy derives from seeing what they perceived as mistaken nuclear posture and nuclear policy, right? So there was an undercurrent an undercurrent preference for nuclear superiority. But really, when McNamara says, well, what we need is assured destruction, assured retaliation. And when we see Nixon even saying, well, we need arms control agreements with the Soviets because the nuclear balance doesn't matter. So this language that's resonating with TNR had been used, but sometime in the mid-70s, the US is trying to go for limited nuclear war options and counterforce and larger arsenals. And that's at that moment that TNR scholars are saying, this nuclear policy is illogical. And maybe there were antecedents there, but the big shock to the posture happens in the mid-70s. So I think this is a puzzle for TNR, but TNR was familiar with it. But the two that have come up more recently is that with qualitative evidence, we see that the Nixon administration actually had a competitive approach to arms control agreements. So yes, they talked about limiting the size of arsenals, but in fact, they were trying to remove any possible limit on qualitative development, which they thought they would have an advantage in, and then perhaps would favor them in future developments. So it's not quite saying let's sit back behind mutually assured destruction, but there might have been a competitive and coercive dimension to arms control agreements. So the first challenge, thank you, Scott. The first challenge is that Washington did pursue nuclear superiority. And the next two, which have come up more recently in the academic literature, is this qualitative evidence about the competitive motivations for the Nixon administration's approach to arms control agreements. And the second one is that as Washington developed these capabilities, it actually came quite close to having devastating first strike towards the end of the Cold War. And this is due to work from Green and Long in particular, but you see it on the US side and on the Soviet side. So this basic assumption that there is a nuclear stalemate and a weaker party could inflict unacceptable damage is something that we've come to question with this evidence. Now, what recent books are taking this argument is to say that, in fact, this pursuit of nuclear superiority, which TNR said was irrational, is in fact rational. It advances US national security interests. And what it does is it helps coerce enemies, and we have some arguments in that direction, and also prevent proliferation from allies. Even though we may look at proliferation from allies, the undertone there could still be that it reassures allies because allies thinks it improves this coercive capability. So really, superiority is rational. We need to explain it. TNR was selective in looking at the historical record. They're happy saying that the Cold War remained cold. And if they see something that goes against their theory, like Washington pursuing nuclear superiority, they say it's irrational. In fact, they should take it into account and explain it, and it does advance security interests. So my response to these books is that pursuing nuclear superiority may be rational, even if it doesn't improve coercive leverage. So if we have policymakers who are uncertain about the effect of their policy, and they're uncertain about whether they are successful, and they learn from these, luckily we haven't had nuclear wars since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then they may end up choosing postures and policies that stay relatively close to what their audiences, domestic and allied, perceive as rational or competent nuclear management. That doesn't mean that the policymakers know that superiority does improve coercive leverage, and that's why they're pursuing it. In fact, this is what we need to show, that this superiority does improve coercion. And so I go back and I think, okay, these critics have looked at what they see as limitations of TNR, but what really they should have looked at is how nukes can coerce in the first place, and then more effectively when there is superiority. And what I find is that, yes, maybe superiority may improve coercive leverage, but really it does it by increasing the risk of disaster, and first strike capabilities are especially dangerous. So what we end up with is a conclusion that's quite similar to what TNR had shared with us, even though they may have taken the stalemate for granted, and taken for granted that nukes can deter, and that the balance of nuclear forces has no effect. Okay, so here's what I want to share for the rest of the talk. So first, I'll talk about these critiques of TNR. So these 4 models or theories critiquing TNR and how we should think of nuclear weapons differently. And then I'll conclude by saying that really what, I'll take them at face value and evaluate their argument, but I also insist on what they should, in my view, have focused on, which is how nukes can compel and overcome deterrence, and then whether superiority helps them. And the basic model will let us appreciate the difficulty of compellence, and then I'll look through the solutions that Schelling has had proposed for these challenges of the credibility of nuclear threats. And I'll conclude on the effect of the nuclear balance in these different scenarios. So 4 models critiquing TNR and 4 models reassessing deterrence compellence. Okay, so if we think about TNR and its critiques, I mentioned that the main work of TNR is a prediction about outcome, peace, and a mechanism that generates this outcome, deterrence. What's curious is that these critiques actually agree on the main prediction and the main mechanism. So if we end up with conclusions that say TNR is wrong, it's a myth, it's a failed revolution, it's strange that these authors actually agree on the main point prediction and on the main mechanism generating this prediction. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind as we go into the details of their arguments and the implications of their arguments. The other is that they are claiming that there is a link between the military balance, nuclear balance, and diplomatic outcomes. So superiority helps coerce more effectively. And I'll just point out there's a tension between this claim and the previous one that nuclear weapons are the ultimate tools of deterrence. So if we want to say that more nukes coerce more effectively, we need to explain how nukes can coerce in the first place. And that's really what I think is missing from these accounts. So if we think about states pursuing superiority, so there is an alternative from the one in which policymakers know that superiority helps coerce, which is one that actually you can find from Jervis's 89, but has also been influential in American politics, in economics with the work of Andrea Pratt, which is this work on transparency. So if we have policymakers trying to craft a policy and their audiences see the policy choice that the leaders are making, but have a hard time evaluating these outcomes, these rational policymakers make you close to what these audiences expect as competent policy. And in fact, that's what I would say applies to this particular case. It's very hard for policymakers to know whether their nuclear strategy is successful. We haven't had a nuclear war, so you could claim that different configurations of nuclear policies have been successful at deterring. It's hard to know. And if that's the case, and there have been previous arguments about what the right policy is, you may craft your own, staying close to previous policy. And so, we can have JFK campaigning on a missile gap. Once he gets in office, he realizes, oh, there is one, but we have more missiles. So let's say that we do benefit from superiority. But then people in his administration wondering, well, how long can we maintain this superiority? Now the Soviets are building and maybe they'll overtake us. And the Nixon administration, after later on coming in and using some language that the audiences were familiar with about mutually assured destruction in justifying these arms control agreements, but also realizing that allies would be surprised if we couldn't repeat to them that we were the ones who were superior. So if we agree on quantitative limitations, we have to maybe make an argument that we can overcome them qualitatively. So these are some ways in which you see the language of policymakers staying close to what's been said before and trying to craft space as the circumstances underneath them are changing over time. So that's just, I understand the TNR critics' reaction to TNR saying, oh, if they didn't pursue what we thought was right, they're irrational, we need to explain it. But again, explaining it doesn't mean that the policymakers knew that they were gaining coercive leverage from these policies. Lieber and Press, so let me go through these 4 theories. Lieber and Press say The biggest anomaly of the nuclear age is the fact that great powers continue to compete. And what we see is that aggressive postures may be beneficial even under MAD, especially for weaker states. And I think those are nice. The second prediction is a nice one, although it's something, again, that we could expect from TNR. It's something we see from Sevipin Narang's work, who had studied at Stanford and CSAC, something we see from some of Bob Powell's work. It doesn't mean that superiority gives you coercive leverage. And again, nuclear states may continue to want to advance their interest, even though they're under mutually assured destruction. So they do really nice work, Lieber and Press, in showing technologically how, the possibility of first strikes has evolved over time, but that doesn't tell us that having this superiority or this devastating first strike gives you coercive leverage. Green is mainly interested in understanding how the US negotiated arms control agreements, and they did because they couldn't prevail without them, and they try to funnel them in ways that they could continue to build their advantage qualitatively. And that's all nice and good, and it's very rich evidence, but again, it doesn't tell us if you have superiority, do you gain coercive leverage? So I think that's something that's missing, and whether once you have them, is it just helping you peacefully, or do you run the risks of accidents, as Scott has mentioned in his review of this book? Gavin is changing the focus to non-proliferation, and he's saying, we observe US opposition to proliferation. It's not compatible with TNR, and that's what explains this pursuit of superiority, that allies wanted to know that the US was superior, which is why they wouldn't want their own nuclear weapons. So I find the focus on proliferation curious because TNR is a theory about the effects of nuclear weapons, not the causes of proliferation. And there are theories of proliferation that are compatible with TNR. So in my own work, I've thought of how nukes being weapons of the weak states really want them, but strong states like the US may not want weak states from acquiring them. So that doesn't assume anything against TNR. It's quite compatible with it. And it may be that superiority helps limit proliferation, but again, is it just this Jervis view that maybe this is imagined and we should break out from it, or that there is actually a benefit? So that's what really needs to be established. And Koenig, who is, so this is an older of the 4 books, but I think is most centrally attacking TNR, is arguing that the US policymakers really believed in this coercive benefit, and it did materialize. And so he's showing simulations of nuclear war where the state that has most nukes can inflict heavier casualty on the other, correlation between superiority and crisis outcomes, some evidence of policymakers believing in nuclear superiority, and then a theory that a superior state should prevail in nuclear crises. Now, the correlation should be taken with a grain of salt because we have a small sample, and we may want to know theoretically whether it would be true that superiority does give coercive benefit. The simulations are nice, but it is to be expected that if I have more nukes, I can inflict more damage. The question is whether it matters politically. And when we look at the qualitative evidence, we see some policymakers agreeing with his point of view, but others disagreeing with it, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Probably the most influential policymakers did not believe in superiority, McNamara, for example. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board, and it's not clear that a nuclear superior state would prevail in a crisis. In a game of chicken, either could prevail. And a weak state may worry that if it's going to be attacked anyway, it needs to be the one who's most aggressive and expecting to prevail. So we need to go back to the drawing board. And if we do, one observation I would make is I shared with you how TNR answered the 2 questions. One is, you use nukes to deter, and greater capabilities don't help coercive leverage. But the scholars themselves kind of hedged in their conclusion. The first is, yes, it's easier to deter, but Schelling says under complete information. So if I know the other side's resolve, it should be easier to deter. But it does beg the question, if you don't know the other side's resolve, is it easier to deter or to compel? And the theories we have don't really take this head on. The second is, if we look at the effect of greater capabilities, Powell recognizes that really it's done by assumption. So we assume that if you get to a disaster, it's an unmitigated disaster. Whether you have more or fewer nukes, it's terrible. So if we assume that nukes don't affect military outcomes, then they won't affect diplomatic outcomes. But if we're in a world where maybe one state breaks out and has a devastating first strike, and maybe it can limit damage on itself, then this is something we need to review. So let me just talk a little bit about the model, and then I'll conclude. So the model has two countries, and they exchange compellent and deterrent threat. And then they end up in this crisis preemption game, which is something Scott encouraged scholars to think about in light of this TNR critiques. And it's a model that Schelling was thinking about too. Can we have war when there is no fundamental reason for it? If I don't want to attack you, but I fear you may attack me, and so we may both end up miscalculating and attacking each other. I'm going to have countries have some hostility parameter. So country I has a hostility HI, which increases its payoff from attacking. And I doesn't know J's hostility, and will believe that it follows some distribution, and I'll use the uniform mainly. So this is what the game looks like. I have country one either dropping to the status quo, where each gets some payoff, dividing the status quo, or it decides to trigger a crisis. So that's making a compellent threat and offering some different division. It could be the same, but some division of the pie. If country two accepts, the states get it. If country two rejects, then country one needs to make a decision about whether to back down, in which case we still have the status quo, or to escalate, in which case we have this crisis preemption game. Okay, so here a compelling threat will succeed if country one triggers a crisis and two accepts. A deterrent threat will succeed if country two rejects and country one backs down. And if they stay in this stalemate, then they will choose simultaneously whether to attack or not. So if they both back down, we're back to the status quo. If country one attacks, it wins with probably P1, it pays a cost C1. By attacking, it gets this benefit, this hostility benefit, whether the other side attacks or not. But if the other side doesn't attack, it also has a benefit of imposing a first strike, which is a benefit for it and a cost for the other side. And if it doesn't attack and two attacks, then it suffers the first strike from the other country. So here I want to replicate what Schelling was thinking about as reciprocal fear of surprise attack, where there's no fundamental reason for war. So I'm going to assume that you're more tempted to attack if the other attacks, and this is this condition here, and that nuclear war brings about this mutually assured destruction. What I mean by that is that there are some types that would actually strictly prefer not to attack, and there are some other types that are the coordinating type. So I don't want to attack if you don't attack, but if you attack, I'd rather attack because I would shield myself from your first strike, which is really the concern Schelling had. But no one strictly wants to attack. So there are no strategy dominant hawk, if you will. So this is this condition here. So these are the conditions I'll use to begin with. And in the first model, and I also want to see, can you coerce? And then what is the effect of greater capabilities? And I'm going to trace two possibilities. One is it affects the war payoffs. So B is the balance and greater values helps country one. So if B is higher, it helps country one at the expense of country two. And then greater capabilities could help the first strike advantage of country one. So this variable F1. So the baseline model, I show an example of an equilibrium, how it can be unique under some conditions. But really, this is the result I want to focus on, which is that under these assumptions I've made, we can see three results. The first is that if there were a peaceful revision of the status quo, then it would have to be that if two rejected, it would lead to war in the crisis preemption game. Because otherwise, two could just reject, and if it never leads to war, then it can be ensured of having its status quo payoff. So it would never accept anything more generous to the other side. The second, though, is that escalation wouldn't be rational for country one if the preemption game leads to war. And that's because my types are either, no one is a strategy dominant hawk, so they don't like to go to war. So they wouldn't want to escalate if it goes to war because that gives them less than backing down and getting the status quo payoff. So what we have here is that there's no equilibrium where the status quo can change peacefully because the threat would only be effective if it's credible, and it's not credible. So that's the impossibility result, if you will, that compellence is hard because you wouldn't make that last leap that triggers nuclear war. But it's also a possibility result in that it shows you, well, how can I get compellence? Well, I can remove the choice for country one, which is what Schelling does when he talks about burning bridges or probabilistic threats, which are milder versions of burning bridges. Or I could just remove the assumption that we're under mad. Maybe there are some types that are these crazy types as strategy dominant hawks that always want to attack. So if I do the first one and I do the burning bridges equilibrium, and I assume that whenever country one makes a threat and says, here's a revision to the status quo, that what would happen after is that if two rejects, we have an escalation and an attack. So that is what Schelling would call turning the tables on country two. Then we can have country one revising the status quo, and the offer is anchored by two's war payoff, which is what it would get in the alternative. And the offer depends on country one's hostility. So the more hostile makes the most aggressive offer. The least hostile makes the most generous offer, and those in between make intermediate offers. And what two would do is it would accept if it's at least sufficiently generous, expecting what it would get if it does go to the crisis preemption game. So those hostile type, relatively hostile type, at least the coordination types, would attack if they expect country one to attack. But those with a lower hostility would not attack. And so here they would, in war, suffer the first strike of the other side. So this is what they get in war. So they want an offer that's at least as generous at what they get in war. And then we have country one making this risk-return trade-off. How hard to push. The more I push, the better is peace for me, but it increases the odds of war. That's sort of the standard risk-return trade-off of the bargaining model. And it's made possible by the fact that one has burned the bridges. So it's made a commitment to escalate an attack. So then if I change the balance of nuclear forces, what we see is that what it does is make one more likely to win at the expense of two, well, it's going to mean a less favorable peace for two, but it won't change the probability of war because it changes both the minimum demands of country two and the offers that country one makes. So it helps, these capabilities just help country one at no increased risk of war. But if what the capabilities do is give a first strike advantage, then it's only going to affect some types. And what it does is it means a less favorable peace for country two, but at an increased risk of war. So country one benefits from the first strike advantage. It gets a more favorable peace, but at an increased risk of disaster, because the types that do care about the first strike advantage are those who are very aggressive. And if they get a first strike, even more of a first strike advantage, they're even more aggressive, and they make offers that are rejected by a greater type, then a greater set of type. And those types of country one don't worry about it as much because they get a better payoff when they do fight these wars against this smaller set of type. So that's the way in which the capabilities can help country one, but at an increased risk of disaster. The probabilistic threats have the same effect. So what it is if country two rejects, country one commits to escalate an attack with some probability, and the complementary probability it backs down. Well, that shows us that these threats are just the middle ground between the baseline model and the burning bridges, and we're going to have the same comparative statics as with the burning bridges model, which is that if what you do with greater capabilities is improve your first strike capabilities, then maybe you do improve your coercive leverage, but at a risk of disaster. And so finally, the last model is the rationality of irrationality. So this madman strategy. So what if I have some types that actually have a strictly dominant strategy to attack? And we're going to see if the others can pretend to be like them and gain more in coercive leverage vis-a-vis country two. So this is saying that the most hostile type satisfy this condition, and I'm going to have that mass having these preferences where they strictly prefer to attack no matter what the other side does. So here I'm going to have many equilibria. Let me talk about one. There's a different one in the paper, but this one is interesting in that it gives interesting comparative statics. So they'll all pool on making this offer here, which is the most aggressive, right? So if I replace an epsilon of 1, it's back to what we had in the previous slide on burning bridges with the most aggressive offer. So they all pool on this offer, and the coordinating or strategy dominant type pretend to be like the irrational types, and they're able to extract some concessions. And if the other side pushes back, then these strategy dominant and coordinating type, they just back down. But it's at a risk of it's at a risk of disaster. And what we have is, in this case, the effect on the first strike capabilities are the same. So if I increase the first strike advantage, I have a smaller set of people that will accept that offer. So the probability of war will go up. But also, if it helps the balance of power, I'm going to have a greater set of types that are these strategy dominant hawks and are willing to run this risk of conflict. Okay, so just to sum up, what we see is TNR being under attack, and other work saying nuclear superiority does help, but either coerce enemies or prevent proliferation from allies. What I want to talk about or argue in evaluating these works is that it's not clear that because policymakers pursue it, that it does lead to greater coercive leverage. They may have had reasons to pursue them that are rational if they want to produce a policy that they expect their audiences to be the right one, and they themselves are uncertain about what the right policy is. So this is, MAD is a fact, not a policy. It's complicated for these policymakers to know which one is the right policy. And finally, that superiority may help coercive leverage, but especially if it's first strike capability, it doesn't do it just peacefully, but it does it by emboldening the coercer and running a greater risk of disaster. So in some sense, the conclusion of TNR, which they had made just assuming there is MAD, continues even if we, and no effect of capabilities continues even if we allow the effect of nuclear capabilities on military outcomes. Okay, so I'll stop here.
We have a very diverse and interesting audience here today with many people from CSAC and other parts of Stanford, faculty and students from other universities, some officials from the US nuclear laboratories, and even a former Nixon administration official who can challenge you or address some of that historical points that you began with. I'm going to collect questions, but I wanted to ask the first one while people are collecting, which is both a criticism of an acceptance that you have in this paper of some of the work by the new counter-revolution school, and then ask what the implications really are of this. You point out quite correctly that people like Green and Long, Green's own book, and especially Kronig, talk about the perceptions of superiority or the quest for superiority existing during the Cold War, and that there wasn't an acceptance of assured destruction by the US military and national security elite. But even on page 3, the examples that you give, I think we have to be really cautious about using them. A state, this is just you citing the others, but you're not criticizing them, which is, they say a State Department memo predicted that we had superiority because we could destroy nearly 70% of the total strategic warheads in a first strike in the mid-1980s, but there were 7,000 warheads at the time. So that would still leave 700 warheads lasting on the United States. And this question is that meaningful superiority? Or
Right.
there's a citation to a senior advisor to the Communist Party Central Committee who says
Right.
that we can only in the 80s destroy less than half of the minimum numbers necessary for assured destruction. Well, that's because he said that you have to hit 250 for assured destruction. But if you can destroy 100 cities, the question is that really meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
So then the question is, when you discuss that, so I think it behooves us to analyze this history, but with a critical eye to what the assumptions are.
Yep.
So then the question for the model that you're doing is whether you can measure nuclear balance in a more subtle way, rather than saying whether this is one side has superiority. If you say that one side, for example, has a small number of weapons that are larger, a larger arsenal, I think that is rather meaningless. If you think that one side has a much larger arsenal and has a plausible first strike capability that could destroy all, not just limit damage, but could destroy all the other side, then I find that much more plausible. In the chicken game, Matt Kroenig has a very convenient metaphor. He says, two trucks going at each other. The bigger truck, the one that has the bigger car, the one that has the larger arsenal, will have an incentive not to swerve, and the smaller one will not swerve. Well, that's probably true if you have a Ford E150 truck and a Prius. But if you have two Mercedes and one has the ornament on it and the other one doesn't, it really doesn't create much incentive for the one without the ornament, the smaller arsenal, to swerve. So can you how would your models differ if you could take a more reasonable measure of superiority that would include plausible first strike capability?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. So if we assume that there is no military difference in changes to nuclear arsenals, then it's very easy to conclude that there will be no diplomatic difference to changes to nuclear arsenals. So I think I do want to leave the possibility that there might be differences. My personal view, when, for example, I talk about the Kroenig argument comparing a scenario in which 70 million Americans die versus 125 million Americans die, I think, to me, the 70 million is terrible. He would want to say, well, that's a meaningful difference. The US should prevail, assuming that we know the numbers on the Soviet side, which he doesn't do, and those are higher. So he would say, well, 70 million is better. It's fewer casualties. We should be more likely to prevail in that case. Right. So I do want to point out that example and the inference that he wants to make from the statistical simulations. I personally do not find them convincing, but I do find it important to entertain the possibility, if it is the case that the US does escape MAD, and it does have this devastating first strike. So these irrational preferences under MAD, maybe they are rational if you can make sure that the other side doesn't strike back. So that's why I want to say, let's entertain that possibility that the capabilities can mean something meaningful militarily, and let's see where it leads diplomatically. So in some sense, TNR leads to the conclusion that it has no diplomatic consequences by assuming it has no military consequence. That's not more satisfying as a theory, especially if we worry about the possibility that states may break out. And on the chicken game, I think Kroenig is sort of informally compelling in saying the bigger car should prevail, but technically wrong in that in the chicken game, there are two equilibria. And if we want to think about which one is more compelling, especially in a scenario where, because of the incredibility of threats, the way in which we could coerce is by running the risk of disaster, then you may have the weaker power thinking that it's the one that needs to be most aggressive. Because if it feels that it's going to be attacked anyway, it may be the one that will be more aggressive in its nuclear threats. And that actually is the statement that we find more empirical support from the work of Vipins and Wout Pauwels, the nukes being the weapons of the weak and the weaker powers being more aggressive. So all this to say, it would be a relatively short exercise if we just said no meaningful difference militarily, leads to no meaningful difference diplomatically. But I do want to entertain that possibility. And what I end up with is something that's actually quite similar to TNR.
Okay, great. I don't see any of the fellows typing in questions, so please do that. But in the meantime, I'll see if I can make this work. Dave Elliott, who's a former National Security Council official in the Nixon administration, is on board. Dave, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, which I thought was very interesting. Are you able to do that? Well, apparently not. So I'll say what he says, and Alex, I want you to think about this. One would need to take also to consider the progress or non-progress in effective missile defenses, which is certainly front and center in the strategic defense dialogue today, and was obviously very important during the Nixon and then later the Russian perceptions during the Reagan administration. Can you think about what would missile defense play and how would it play into your modeling?
Yeah, so I mean, as it is, the model would crudely incorporate it in the sense that what we can vary is the probability of victory or the benefit or cost from suffering a first strike. And so I could see with a ballistic missile defense system, being able to shield yourself from attacks from the other side, either as first strikes or as retaliation. And so you can make an argument that they matter in this way. What I see in the historical record, and I included some quotes from Green in the paper, is even with these large arsenals, and I personally think, well, even if you have 70 nukes hitting your territory, these are just unimaginable levels of destruction that I would think policymakers would be very cautious. Even so, it strikes me how even at large numbers of nuclear weapons, folks in the Nixon administration sort of changed their perception on whether the other side could get ahead. Oh no, no one would strike first. Oh, maybe we can strike first. And that view really shifts and transitions in a small number of years, looking at really large arsenals. And that to me was informative for me. I would not have expected these types of assessments.
Great. I have Ryan Musto. If you could introduce yourself, and I believe you need to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Dr. Debs, for your presentation. My name is Ryan Musto. I'm a MacArthur Nuclear Security Fellow here at CSEC. And I actually typed my question into the Q&A, but I'll just read it out for everyone in case they can't see it. So I said, your work is highly theoretical, and when it gives a few rough historical examples, it's US-centric. And so I was wondering why you don't do more to understand the historical record when it comes to the reaction of US adversaries in crisis situations when the United States had nuclear superiority. And so one example I give, which you kind of raised with McNamara, is that it would seem that Khrushchev's position and thoughts on nuclear superiority would have mattered much more than McNamara's or the Kennedy administrations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, I appreciate it. So I look at the US, or I think about the possibility of the US gaining superiority, because I think that this is the crux of the debate between TNR and its critics, where the critics say, we both acknowledge, supporters and critics, that the US seem to be pursuing this, but TNR scholars say it's irrational, and critics say, no, it is rational, it advances interest. So I did want the theory to address that particular possibility. It was interesting to me in thinking about how a state may pursue superiority, even though it doesn't know whether it will increase its coercive leverage, and trace the possible consequences for adversaries. So towards the end of that section, what's interesting to me, I talk about how, okay, so the US talks about superiority because the Kennedy administration had said there is a missile gap, it's terrible. Now they have the advantage in the missile gap, so they'll tout it. Well, the Soviets are listening, so they're investing in their nuclear capabilities, and they're building a larger arsenal. And then the Americans have to agree that the Soviet arsenal in SALT will be larger than the American arsenal. So it's easier at that point in time for the Soviet leaders to say, yeah, it doesn't matter how many nukes you have because they're the ones with the larger numbers. But these types of statements about what's competent can come back to bite you in that, well, as the US is continuing to invest in qualitative capability, then the Soviets can say, well, how does that match with what you told me about mutually assured destruction if you're continuing to invest in the capability that would give you the possibility of having first strikes. So I think there's a ton there. The focus is on the US and coercive leverage in the context of a crisis, but there's definitely more to do.
Lauren Sukin, you're up next.
Hi, Alex. So this was a really fascinating presentation. I have some work that shows that the advantage of superiority decreases as the size of the difference between two states' arsenals increases. So put another way, superiority could provide an advantage when states have similarly sized arsenals, but vastly inferior states have empirically been able to resist coercion. So North Korea, for example, has largely been able to resist the United States. Do you think some states do you think some states might view superiority as rational in some settings and irrational in others? Or how might the predictions of your model be different if we assume that nuclear states have multiple adversaries that they can leverage their nuclear arsenals against? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I'm sympathetic to the basic assumption of TNR that nukes are the weapons of the weak. And so a weak state having nuclear weapons may significantly improve its security situation vis-a-vis stronger states. Yeah, I think so. This is really going beyond the model. The closest element that comes to this consideration is just how policymakers may use a certain posture, thinking that it is seen as competent with a particular audience in mind. But if there are multiple audiences, they may draw different conclusions. And we just talked about how talking about superiority to the domestic audience may come back to haunt you when the adversaries are trying to make inference about what you're trying to do with your capabilities. So it would go beyond. And what is in the model, I just make directional predictions there. So I'm not imposing particular functional forms, which you would need to do to make sense of differences at different level of the balance. I'm just trying to see if you have more, does it gives you coercive leverage and at a risk of a disaster? But what you're pointing towards would be a nice follow-on work to do.
We have a follow-on question. One of the things that's nice about doing this on Zoom, as unpleasant as it is in most ways, is that you get some unusual participants. And here we have Lieutenant Colonel Gonzalo Vergara, who was a B-52 pilot and has a good question. I think I've made it so that you can respond directly, Lieutenant Colonel Vergara. Can you hear me or can you speak?
Hi, good afternoon to both of you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. It's very interesting because I actually experienced most of the stuff we're talking about, but it's been in B-52s in 1980 Strategic Air Command. And interesting, always said is that it would appear only apply to large nations. For example, what about small geographical nations such as the DPRK or Israel, which in effect 5 to 10 nuclear strikes would be sufficient to paralyze the political, if not destroy as a physical society? Because what I'm saying is I think that geographical size matters, and I think it's most important to that. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Debs?
So yes, just reflecting also on Scott's initial question about how many is enough to be considered an unmitigated disaster for policymakers. I mean, I have my own personal view, and I would put that number as quite low. So you don't need that many casualties to contemplate a nuclear war and conclude that it's something you definitely want to avoid. So I would agree that smaller states may be more concerned, and I think this may maybe get at some of the work that Bob Powell did, thinking about how states with different capabilities or different size are more or less aggressive in making their nuclear threat. So you may have this situation of of using them or losing them. So if you start a conflict and the other side could really destroy you quickly, then that may actually make it more unstable and more likely to escalate because you want to preempt the other side. So that's something that's not directly sort of explored in the model as it is, but there's other work that I think would be sympathetic to the perspective you're presenting, and I would agree with that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a great question from James Davis. So James, if you could introduce yourself to Alex and then ask your question.
Sure, I'm James Davis. I'm a visiting scholar here from University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. Question is, how do you conceptualize superiority? And do the two states in the model have to have the same theory of superiority? So I could think of at least three ways you might think of that. It's relative to the other side's weapons, it's relative to the target set on the other side, or it's a qualitative dimension. So how do you conceptualize superiority, and do the two parties have to have the same theory in order for the results you have to be robust?
Mm-hmm. So on the first strike capabilities result, which is the one that I think it gets at whether we can assume that there is mutually assured destruction, or one state may break out and have enough first strike capabilities that maybe it could be rational for a state to entertain that a first strike. I mean, there's not much is being assumed. All that is being assumed is that greater capabilities do improve the damage that you would inflict on the other side with a first strike. So it's quite minimal and flexible in that way. I think so. There's definitely greater richness in the historical record in that we can think about postures and the way in which states declare or present that they would use nuclear weapons. And in this particular model, apart from the concessions that one side is asking of the other on the status quo, the model doesn't incorporate these types of postures and declarations, and how the other side interprets certain actions being taken as compatible or incompatible with what the other side has declared initially. So I think those would be interesting questions to explore further.
As we're coming up to the witching time, but I do have a broader question on methods for you here, which is, it strikes me that two-person game theory is less relevant today than it may have been in the past. So if you think about some of your models, we'd be concerned today in a crisis with Russia about China. It was a minor player back in the 60s when a lot of these theories were developed. If China was involved in a crisis with North Korea and the United States got involved, we'd have to worry about multiple balances, one in which we have numeric superiority but not particularly meaningful, another one where we do have very meaningful superiority, but joining them together can create other dynamics. So why aren't game theorists taking the next move forward, which would make their work more relevant to contemporary military balance questions by having multipolar, triangular theories, as complicated as that would be?
So I can't speak for the full field. In terms of the way that I approach this question, it would be asking myself, what are the minimum elements that I would need to think about? So do we do justice to the argument that deterrence should be easier than compellence, or the challenges that compellent state would have to overcome, just in order for their threats to be effective? And again, it's just a matter of positive science and working on it incrementally and step by step. And so here, what you have is a richer or more complicated interaction, in that you have both compellent and deterrent threats, and they're effectively labeled as such, and there is bargaining. So these are not the binary choices that we've seen in previous models, but actually some bargaining where the size of the demands can vary by states, and then ultimately they face this crisis preemption game. So for me, this was as much as I could chew at this moment, but I think it is important, and definitely going back to an early question about ballistic missile defense, can be interpreted one way vis-a-vis one state, but then other states may really complain about it. And those are some of the strategic dynamics in Northeast Asia, that the US may say, no, I worry about North Korea, there's no ill intent vis-a-vis other states, but these other states may say, well, yes, but you're weakening my retaliatory second strike, which was the basis of the stability of deterrence initially. So those are definitely important questions.
Yeah, I mean, this holds with India, Pakistan, and China, with China, Russia, and the US today. So I think this is going to be an area to move forward. But there are a few other questions, but I think we really don't have time because we do have a very strict policy. So the other individuals who had questions, please just email them to Alex. This is a draft paper, and all comments benefit.
Yes, absolutely.
Benefit the author. So please move forward with those connections. And part of what makes CSAC work effectively, I think, is that it creates a network of scholars who have similar interests and can help make each other's work better. So Alex, just remains to thank you for joining us on this seminar, and let's hope next time you'll be able to be in sunny Palo Alto, okay?
Yes. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.